Have you ever wondered why the people you bend over backwards for seem to respect you the least? It's a painful truth many of us have experienced. The more accommodating you become, the more others take you for granted. What if I told you that the most influential people in history weren't the ones who said yes to everything, but those who strategically said no? This paradox of boundaries reveals something profound about human psychology that most of us get completely backward. Think about the people in your life who command the most respect. Are they the ones constantly available, always saying yes, perpetually accommodating? Or are they the ones whose time and attention feel valuable precisely because they're not endlessly available? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your willingness to be a doormat isn't being perceived as helpfulness or kindness. It's being read as a signal about your worth. And every time you say yes when you want to say no, you're teaching others exactly how little they need to value what you offer. But there's a more intriguing question lurking beneath the surface. How do you establish boundaries without becoming cold or alienating others? How do you shift from being perceived as infinitely available to being seen as valuable and worthy of respect? This transformation requires understanding a psychological principle that dates back centuries, one that powerful figures throughout history have used to command influence while earning deep respect. It's a principle that will fundamentally change how others respond to you. And it begins with understanding the surprising power of strategic scarcity. To truly understand the paradox of boundaries, we need to examine the work of Robert Cialdini, whose groundbreaking research on influence revealed a principle he called scarcity. In his seminal work, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, Cialdini demonstrated that humans place higher value on things that are less available. This principle explains why limited edition products sell out instantly, why exclusive offers generate more interest, and why playing hard to get can sometimes increase romantic attraction. But Cialdini's work goes deeper than merely explaining marketing tactics. It reveals something fundamental about how we assign value to people. What Cialdini discovered was that scarcity doesn't just affect how we perceive objects, it profoundly impacts how we perceive people. When someone makes themselves endlessly available, continuously accommodating, and perpetually agreeable, they inadvertently trigger the opposite of the scarcity principle. They become, in psychological terms, abundant, and therefore less valued. This insight connects directly to our opening paradox. The more you make yourself available without boundaries, the less others value your time, attention, and contributions. But Cialdini's work only scratches the surface of this phenomenon. The ancient Stoic philosopher Seneca understood this principle centuries earlier when he wrote, "It is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the one who hankers after more." Seneca recognized that how we present our boundaries to others shapes how they perceive our worth. By establishing clear limits on what we will and won't accept, we create the psychological conditions for others to value us more highly. But there's a critical caveat that many miss when applying these principles. The effectiveness of boundaries isn't just about saying no more often. It's about the strategic application of when to say no and when to say yes. This selective boundary setting is what separates truly influential people from those who simply become rigid or distant. This brings us to a fascinating question. How do you determine which boundaries to set? Where is the line between being appropriately boundaried and being simply unavailable? And most importantly, how do you communicate these boundaries in a way that increases respect rather than creating resentment? To answer these questions and fully understand how to apply Cialdini's scarcity principle in your own life, we need to explore the psychological distinction between being a doormat and being influential, a distinction that reveals the true power of strategic boundaries. The transformation from doormat to influential boundary setter begins with understanding a crucial psychological distinction. When you're a doormat, You're operating from what psychologists call an external locus of control, the belief that your circumstances are primarily controlled by outside forces. In contrast, influential people operate from an internal locus of control. They believe their choices and actions determine their outcomes. This distinction is critical because it reveals why simply saying no isn't enough. Effective boundary setting isn't about rejection. It's about clarifying your values and priorities in a way that others can respect. Let me illustrate this through 3 paradoxical principles that govern the relationship between boundaries and influence. Paradox 1. The more you value your no, the more others value your yes. When you rarely say no, your yes becomes expected rather than appreciated. It loses its meaning. Consider a colleague who agrees to every request, no matter how unreasonable or inconvenient. When they say yes, no one feels particularly grateful because their agreement was presumed from the start. In contrast, someone who thoughtfully considers requests and occasionally declines them creates a different impression. Their yes feels meaningful. It wasn't automatic or obligatory. It was a deliberate choice. This explains why people with clear boundaries often receive more gratitude for their contributions than those who say yes to everything. Their selectivity makes their agreement feel valuable rather than expected. Paradox 2. Boundaries don't decrease connection. They deepen it. Many people avoid setting boundaries because they fear rejection or conflict. The doormat believes, if I say no, they won't like me anymore. This fear reveals a profound misunderstanding of human psychology. Research by social psychologist Vanessa Bones found that people actually respect those who set clear boundaries, seeing them as more confident and competent. More surprisingly, clear boundaries create the conditions for deeper, authentic connection. When you're a doormat, relationships become transactional. You're valued for what you'll do rather than who you are. But when you establish boundaries, you create space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than utility. Consider how we naturally respect those who have standards. We may initially feel disappointed when someone declines a request, but that disappointment typically transforms into respect when we recognize they're operating from clear principles rather than people-pleasing reflexes. Paradox 3. The most influential people focus on others while maintaining self-respect. The final paradox resolves a common misconception that being boundaried means being selfish. In reality, the most influential people maintain a dual focus. They care genuinely about others while simultaneously respecting themselves. Machiavelli, often misunderstood as advocating ruthlessness, actually argued for this balanced approach in The Prince. He suggested that true influence comes not from manipulating others, but from earning their respect through consistent principles. The prince who is respected wields more sustainable power than the prince who is merely feared or loved. This dual focus explains why strategic boundary setters can say no to a request while still making others feel valued. They decline the specific ask without rejecting the person. This distinction is evident in how they communicate their boundaries, not with resentment or anger, but with clarity and respect. For example, imagine your co-worker asks you to take on an additional project when you're already at capacity. A doormat might reluctantly agree while internally resenting the request. A person with poor boundaries might harshly decline and damage the relationship. But the influential boundary setter might say, I appreciate you thinking of me for this project. Given my current workload and commitment to delivering quality work, I can't take this on right now. I'd be happy to discuss it again after I complete my current projects next month. This response maintains connection while clearly establishing limits, the perfect balance that increases rather than diminishes influence. But here's where many people get stuck. How do you practically implement these paradoxical principles in everyday interactions? How do you communicate boundaries in a way that increases respect rather than creating distance? The answer lies in understanding the precise psychological mechanics of boundary setting, the specific language, timing, and delivery that transforms boundaries from barriers into bridges. Let me ask you directly, how many times in the past week have you agreed to something you resented? How often have you said yes when your mind and body were screaming no? And what has this pattern of accommodation actually gotten you? If you're like most people who struggle with boundaries, your immediate answer might be peace or avoiding conflict. But let's be honest about the deeper costs. That momentary peace comes at the expense of genuine respect. That avoidance of external conflict creates internal conflict instead. The growing resentment that builds every time you sacrifice your needs for others. The uncomfortable truth is that your doormat tendencies aren't serving you or others. They're creating a version of you that's increasingly hollow, increasingly resentful, and increasingly invisible in the relationships that matter most. This isn't just theory. Psychological research consistently shows that people with poor boundaries experience higher rates of burnout, depression, and relationship dissatisfaction. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology found that employees who struggled to set work boundaries reported 26% higher levels of emotional exhaustion and 33% higher levels of psychological distress. But there's something even more painful at play here. Your difficulty with boundaries likely stems from a core belief that your needs don't matter as much as others, a belief that may have been reinforced throughout your life. Perhaps you learned early that love and approval were conditional on your compliance. Perhaps you internalized the message that your worth was tied to your usefulness. I'm telling you now, with absolute certainty, that this belief is false, not just slightly mistaken, fundamentally, categorically wrong. Your needs, your time, your energy, these are not infinite resources to be distributed to whoever asks. They are precious, limited, and worthy of protection, and the people who truly deserve your yes will respect your right to say no. But here's where many boundary-setting attempts fail. They focus exclusively on the external skill of saying no, without addressing the internal belief that makes saying no feel impossible. True transformation requires both the practical techniques of boundary setting and the deeper work of recalibrating your sense of worth. This is why simply learning scripts for saying no often doesn't create lasting change. You might successfully decline a request once or twice, but without addressing the underlying belief that your worth depends on your compliance, you'll eventually revert to old patterns. The path forward requires courage, the courage to experience temporary discomfort for long-term respect. It requires recognizing that the brief anxiety of setting a boundary pales in comparison to the chronic resentment of living without them. But this transformation remains incomplete without understanding the specific techniques that allow you to communicate boundaries in a way that increases influence rather than diminishing it. How exactly do you phrase these boundaries? How do you handle the inevitable pushback? And how do you distinguish between situations that warrant accommodation and those that demand firmness? The art of influential boundary setting comes down to three key elements: clarity, consistency, and compassionate delivery. First, clarity. Effective boundaries aren't vague or apologetic. They're direct and specific. Instead of saying, "I'm not sure if I can make it," you say, "I won't be able to attend." Instead of, "I'll try to get to it," you say, "I can complete this by Friday." This clarity eliminates the ambiguity that allows others to misinterpret or push against your boundaries. Second, consistency. The most common boundary-setting mistake is inconsistency, establishing a limit, then abandoning it when faced with resistance. This teaches others that your boundaries are negotiable if they push hard enough. Truly influential people maintain consistency in their boundaries, which eventually trains others to respect those limits without testing them. Third, compassionate delivery. The difference between being boundaried and being cold lies in how you communicate those boundaries. Stating a boundary with empathy sounds like, "I understand this project is important, and I'm not able to take it on while maintaining the quality of my current commitments." This approach respects both your limits and the other person's needs. These three elements transform boundary setting from a defensive act into an influential one. When implemented consistently, they create a powerful shift in how others perceive and respond to you. People stop seeing you as a convenience and start seeing you as someone worthy of respect. Let me give you a practical example. Imagine your friend consistently calls you late at night to vent about their problems, leaving you exhausted the next day. An influential boundary might sound like, "I care about you and want to support you. I need to be well rested for work, so I'm available to talk until 9 p.m. on weeknights. After that, I'll need to continue our conversation the next day." This clear, consistent, and compassionately delivered boundary protects your needs while affirming the relationship. The ultimate paradox is this: by occasionally saying no, you make your yes infinitely more valuable. By protecting your time and energy, you have more to give when you choose to give it. By respecting yourself first, you create the conditions for others to respect you too. This isn't just about avoiding doormat status. It's about becoming someone whose opinions matter, whose time is valued, and whose agreement is meaningful rather than assumed. If you've truly understood the power of strategic boundaries, leave a comment below with, "My no creates value for my yes," to show you've reached this important insight. I'm genuinely curious how many of you have experienced this paradox in your own lives. Remember that your journey toward influential boundary setting is exactly that, a journey, not a destination. Each time you honor your boundaries, you're strengthening not just your influence with others, but your relationship with yourself. The distinction between being respected and being liked is critical here. While doormats might be temporarily liked for their compliance, they're rarely deeply respected. And ultimately, respect creates more meaningful connection than mere likability ever could. As you move forward from this video, I challenge you to notice opportunities for boundary setting in your daily life. Start small. Decline a minor request that doesn't align with your priorities. Pay attention to how it feels, how others respond, and how your relationship to yourself shifts in that moment of honoring your own needs. This practice of strategic boundary setting, this paradox that saying no actually makes your yes more powerful, is just one aspect of developing true influence. The kind that comes from authenticity rather than manipulation, from self-respect rather than people-pleasing. If today's message about the paradox of boundaries resonated with you, hit subscribe right now, because in my next video, I'll be revealing the counterintuitive communication techniques that make others eager to hear your perspective rather than resistant to it. These techniques build directly on the boundary principles we've discussed today, creating a complete system for ethical influence. The paradox of boundaries is just the beginning. Subscribe to continue this journey from doormat to respected influencer, because the world needs more people who can lead authentically rather than comply reluctantly.